Captain Jorn Arstel hated mornings. Or more accurately, he hated mornings when his ship, Solstice, decided that the best way to wake him up was by blaring a siren that sounded like a cat being strangled. "New day, new death wish," he mumbled, swinging his legs over the bunk and reaching for his boots. "What is it this time, Solstice?" Impending doom detected, the AI chirped back too cheerfully for Jorn's liking. "Can you be more specific? Like coffee first," he groaned, pulling on his jacket. It was emblazoned with the words Solar Shepherd, a title that sounded far more noble than it felt. "A rogue planet, Captain, headed straight for us." "Collision course in approximately 2 months," Solstice replied, still relentlessly chipper. Jorn paused halfway through buttoning his shirt. 2 months isn't exactly a morning emergency, Solstice. You woke me up for this. I'd argue certain annihilation merits some urgency, Captain. "I can't argue with you there," he sighed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "All right. Time to gather the merry band of misfits." The ship's corridors were narrow, barely accommodating the passage of its crew. Jorn found Becker and Zane in the mess hall, engaged in their usual morning ritual of trying to outsnark each other. Becker, the ship's engineer, was stirring a cup of something that vaguely resembled coffee. She had a knack for fixing things, usually things the rest of the crew had given up on. "Morning, Cap. Solstice give you the good news yet?" "Yeah, rogue planet," Jorn replied, grabbing a mug for himself. "How's your coffee?" "About as encouraging as our chances of survival," she smirked, taking a sip. Zane, the navigator, looked up from his plate of questionably edible protein mush. "So what's the plan, Cap?" "Do we sit here and hope the planet takes a sharp left? That or we find a way to give it a shove," Jorn replied, leaning against the counter. "Ideas?" "Yeah, I got one," Zane said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "We could all bend over and kiss our asses goodbye." "Productive as ever, Zane," Jorn shot back, rolling his eyes. "Becker, any thoughts?" She shrugged, setting her cup down with a clank. "Well, unless anyone's got a planet-sized tennis racket lying around, we might be screwed." "I was hoping for something more optimistic," Jorn said, though he couldn't help but chuckle. "All right, let's get everyone together. We need a plan." The crew gathered in the cramped briefing room, its walls decorated with faded posters from an era when space travel was still considered glamorous. Jorn looked around at his team, a collection of dropouts, reprobates, and one guy whose only talent seemed to be surviving questionable life choices. "All right, team, you've heard the news. Suggestions?" A pause, and then Kent, the communications officer, spoke up. "Could we, I don't know, transmit a strongly worded message to the universe?" "Ask it nicely to move the planet." "Sure, Kent, why don't you draft that up?" Jorn replied dryly. "But first we need real solutions." "Seriously, Cap," Becker said, crossing her arms. "We could try to alter its course. Use our solar sails, build a force field, something." Zane snorted. "And where do we get the power for this miracle?" "My last check said we weren't exactly a Death Star." "We're sitting on a solar farm the size of a small moon," Becker countered. "It's not about the quantity of power, Zane, it's how we use it." "You heard her," Jorn said with a smirk. "Time to turn that solar farm into a cosmic slingshot." As the meeting wrapped up, Becker pulled Jorn aside. "Cap, you think we can actually do this?" "Becker, I have no damn clue," he admitted. "But I'd rather go out trying than waiting for a planet to flatten us." She nodded, a rare moment of seriousness. "Guess we better get to work then." The next few days were a blur of activity, the Solstice's crew working around the clock. Becker commandeered the engine room, turning it into a chaotic symphony of sparks and cursing. "Hey, watch where you're aiming that torch," Jorn barked, ducking under a low-hanging pipe. "Calm down, Cap. Just adding a little heat to the situation," Becker replied, her voice muffled behind a welding mask. "Let's not add burning alive to our list of problems, yeah?" Meanwhile, Zane was hunched over his charts, clutching a stylus like a weapon. "We might be able to swing this," he muttered to himself. "Or we might just be inventing a new form of cosmic suicide." "Sounds like a win-win," Jorn quipped, peering over Zane's shoulder. "You know, when I signed up for this gig, I thought space would be bigger," Zane said. Sorry to disappoint, Jorn replied. But hey, at least you'll have a hell of a story to not live to tell. Comforting, Zane said, rolling his eyes. 2 weeks in, Jorn found himself standing on the observation deck, staring at the distant ball of fury that was the sun. So much for retirement, he muttered. His reflection looked just as tired and ragged as he felt. The door slid open with a hiss, and Kent walked in. Penny for your thoughts, Cap. They're all worth less than that, Jorn replied, eyes still on the solar inferno. Think we'll make it? Kent asked, joining him at the railing. Depends. Did you finish that strongly worded letter to the universe? Kent chuckled. I sent it. No response yet. Figures, Jorn sighed, finally turning away. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and maybe pray to whatever gods still bother listening. The day finally came when Becker announced they were ready. Well, ready as we'll ever be, she said, wiping grease from her hands. The crew assembled one last time in the briefing room, a sense of grim anticipation hanging in the air. All right, folks, Jorn began. Today we either become legends or just another tragic footnote. I vote legend, Zane said, raising a hand. Seconded, Becker added with a nod. Jorn grinned despite himself. Let's go annoy the hell out of a rogue planet. The solstice shook and groaned as the engines roared to life, the solar sails unfurling like giant wings. Jorn gripped the armrests of his chair, the familiar mix of adrenaline and fear coursing through him. Here we go, he muttered, eyes locked on the viewscreen. The ship shuddered violently as it angled toward the incoming planet, the solar panels absorbing and redirecting the sun's energy in a desperate gambit to alter its course. Come on, you ugly bastard, Jorn grumbled, teeth gritted against the strain. Becker clung to her console, monitoring the energy levels. We're giving it all she's got, Cap. Zane's fingers flew over his navigation controls. Trajectory is changing. Not by much, but it's something. Keep it steady, Jorn barked, every muscle in his body tense. For a few excruciating moments it felt as though the universe held its breath. Then the ship's sensors chirped with a new reading. Holy hell, Kent breathed from his station. It's working. The crew erupted into a cacophony of cheers and relieved laughter, the tension breaking like a wave. Jorn slumped back in his chair, grinning like a fool. Well, I'll be damned. Becker gave him a thumbs up, her usual sarcasm softened by a genuine smile. Not bad for a bunch of misfits, huh, Cap? Not bad at all, he replied, feeling the weight of the universe lift ever so slightly. As the crew celebrated their improbable victory, Jorn allowed himself a moment to breathe, to savor the improbability of their survival. But in the back of his mind, he knew this was just the beginning. The universe had a way of throwing curveballs, and he'd learned long ago to never get too comfortable. For now, though, they'd managed to outwit a rogue planet, and that was enough. At least until the next disaster came knocking. But then, that was life on the solstice. As the ship sailed on through the vastness of space, Jorn knew one thing for certain: boredom was never going to be a problem. All right, team, Jorn said, standing at the head of the mess hall table like a beleaguered teacher addressing a particularly unruly class. We've got a rogue planet on a collision course. Ideas, besides the Superlacer plan? Becker asked, drumming her fingers on the table. Because I'd love to hear another option that doesn't involve us pretending to be some kind of intergalactic pest control. Yeah, like maybe we just call it a day and go into cryo-sleep. Wake up when the universe has sorted itself out, Zane added, his trademark sarcasm on full display. Before Jorn could respond with his usual mix of sarcasm and resignation, Dr. Tessa Cord, the ship's astrogator, entered the room. She had the demeanor of a person who had spent too much time looking into the abyss of space and found it unimpressively chaotic. Captain, I've calculated the planet's trajectory, she announced, her tone as dry as a Martian desert. Let me guess, Jorn said, raising an eyebrow. We're right on its squish zone, pretty much, Tessa replied, dropping a data pad on the table. We're about to become the universe's most expensive roadkill. Fantastic, Becker muttered. Any chance of shifting its course with what we've got? Tessa sighed, running a hand through her hair. Not unless you've got a superlaser stashed somewhere in engineering that I don't know about. Becker and Zane exchanged a look. It was the kind of look that suggested they both thought they might actually have a shot at this, provided they didn't blow themselves up in the process. "We've got the solar farm," Becker said. "Maybe we can rig it into something more persuasive." "Persuasive," Jorn repeated, leaning against the table. "As in, please don't smash us into cosmic dust persuasive." "That's the plan, Cap," Becker replied, a glint of mischief in her eyes. Jorn looked around the table, taking in the expressions of his crew. They were a ragtag bunch of misfits and miscreants, but damned if they weren't resourceful. If anyone could turn a solar farm into a superlaser, it was this lot. "All right," he said, steeling himself for the madness to come. "Let's weaponize our solar farm." "Because why not?" Zane quipped. "When life gives you a rogue planet, build a death ray." The crew dispersed, each member heading to their stations with a renewed sense of purpose, or at least, a slightly delayed sense of inevitable doom. Jorn followed Becker to engineering, a cramped, chaotic space that smelled faintly of burnt metal and desperation. "All right, Becker," Jorn said, eyeing the tangle of wires and machinery. "What's our first step?" She grinned, grabbing a wrench with the confidence of someone who was about to perform a miracle or die trying. "First, we figure out how not to blow ourselves to smithereens. Then we harness the sun's energy, focus it through our solar panels, and hope for the best." "Simple plan," Jorn said, raising an eyebrow. "Very straightforward." "Hey, straightforward plans mean fewer ways to screw up," Becker replied, already elbow-deep in the guts of the engine. "Of course, simpler doesn't mean safer." "Thanks for the reminder," Jorn muttered. "Anything I can do to help?" "Stay out of the way and pray," Becker said, her voice echoing from somewhere inside the machinery. "Oh, and maybe get Solstice to do some calculations." "We're going to need every bit of help we can get." "Solstice," Jorn called, tapping his comm. "You there?" "Always, Captain," the AI chirped back. "Ready to assist with your impending doom." "Glad you're so chipper about it," Jorn sighed. "We need calculations on maximizing solar energy output. Think you can handle that?" "I'll run the numbers," Solstice replied. "And try not to explode the ship in the process." "That'd be great, thanks," Jorn said dryly. Meanwhile, Zane was at the navigation console, plotting trajectories and muttering to himself. "If we angle the ship just right, we might get enough of a boost to change our course, or we might just end up spiraling into oblivion." Jorn joined him, scanning the ever-shifting star map. "You sound confident." "Confidence is for people with options," Zane shot back. "We've got a death wish and a prayer." "One hell of a combination," Jorn said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Keep at it." Iors turned into a blur of activity as the crew worked tirelessly to transform their solar farm into a makeshift superlaser. Becker's domain was a cacophony of clanking tools, sizzling equipment, and the occasional curse word when something inevitably went wrong. "You sure this won't turn us into a giant floating ball of flame?" Jorn asked, stopping by to check on progress. Becker glanced up, sweat dripping down her forehead. "Nope, but it'll be impressive if it does." "Good enough for me," Jorn replied with a smirk. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime but was probably closer to 2 weeks, Becker declared the modifications complete. "We're ready to fire this thing up, Cap, or, watch it explode spectacularly." "Optimism," Jorn said, shaking his head. "Always your strong suit." The crew gathered once more, this time on the bridge, each member at their station, tense with anticipation. The rogue planet loomed on the view screen, an indifferent mass of rock and ice coming to ruin their day. "All right, team," Jorn addressed them. "This is it. We either stop that thing or become a cautionary tale." "Hey, at least we'll be famous," Zane said, cracking his knuckles. "Assuming there's anyone left to tell the tale," Tessa muttered under her breath. "Let's do this," Becker said, her voice steady as she initiated the sequence. The ship hummed with energy, solar panels absorbing the sun's rays and channeling it into a focused beam. The crew watched, holding their collective breath as the beam shot out into space, aiming for the rogue planet. "Steady," Jorn commanded, eyeing the readings on his console. The beam struck the planet, a bright flash lighting up the view screen. For a moment, it seemed like nothing had happened. Then slowly, the planet's trajectory began to shift. "It's working," Tessa said, her voice laced with disbelief. "Keep it steady," Jorn repeated, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. The beam continued to pour energy into the planet, altering its path bit by bit. The tension on the bridge was palpable, a silent prayer running through each crew member's mind. Finally, Zane looked up from his console, a rare grin spread across his face. "Trajectory has shifted enough to give us a fighting chance." A collective sigh of relief washed over the crew, the weight of doom lifting ever so slightly. "Well, I'll be damned," Jorn said, a laugh escaping him. "We did it." "Of course we did," Becker said, her smile as bright as the beam they'd fired. "We're too stubborn to go out like that." The crew broke into cheers, the mood on the bridge shifting from tense to jubilant. For a moment, they allowed themselves the luxury of victory, the kind of celebration that came from defying the odds and living to tell the tale. Jorn leaned back, eyes on the view screen, watching as the rogue planet drifted harmlessly off course. "All right, team," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. "Let's go find something else to ruin our day. And here I was thinking we might get a day off," Zane said, shaking his head. "Not on my watch," Jorn replied with a grin. "Besides, we've got a reputation to uphold." As the solstice continued its journey through the void, Jorn couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for his crew. They'd faced the impossible and come out on top, proving that even in the bleakest of circumstances, a little ingenuity and a lot of stubbornness went a long way. "What's next on the agenda, Solstice?" Jorn asked, leaning back in his chair. "Well," the AI replied cheerfully, "now that the rogue planet is no longer a threat, we only have the usual assortment of cosmic disasters to contend with." "Great," Jorn said, smirking. "Wouldn't want things to get boring." With the crisis averted, the crew settled back into their routine, each member returning to their stations with a sense of accomplishment. They might be a ragtag bunch navigating the unforgiving expanse of space, but they were survivors. And for now, that was enough. As Jorn looked around at his crew, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever the universe threw their way next, they'd face it together. And with any luck, they'd outwit, outlast, and outlive whatever cosmic calamity decided to make them its next target. The Solstice's engine room looked like a mechanical mosh pit, with cables and panels strewn about like the aftermath of a particularly rowdy robot rave. Engineer Ivo Drake hovered over the ship's solar farm like a surgeon with dubious credentials, squinting at the jury-rigged mess of components. "No offense, but this looks like a war crime," Jorn said, crossing his arms as he leaned against a nearby bulkhead. "Yeah, well, you try converting a solar farm into a superlaser with a toolkit that hasn't been updated since before my last hangover," Ivo shot back, his voice a mixture of irritation and concentration. "Could be worse," Zane chimed in, from his perch atop an overturned crate. "We could be trying this sober." "You're doing what you can, Ivo," Becker said, giving him a reassuring pat on the back. "Just remember, if it blows up, try to aim it away from the coffee machine." The ship's intercom crackled to life, Solstice's voice cutting through the room like a chipper angel of doom. "Captain Jorn, I must inform you that current energy output calculations are not promising. We may not have enough power to, as you say, fry the interstellar potato." "Fantastic," Jorn muttered. "Remind me to buy a new calculator." "Always looking on the bright side," Cap Zane quipped. "Or should I say the dim side," Ivo sighed, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. "The problem is the power conduits. They're not designed to handle this kind of load. I'm pretty sure I'm about to turn the whole system into a giant sparkler." "Great," Jorn replied with a smirk. "Maybe we can throw a light show for the rogue planet before it smashes us into oblivion." Morale, much like the ship's power output, was rapidly dwindling. The crew wore their frustrations like ill-fitting spacesuits, tight, uncomfortable, and liable to leak in all the wrong places. They had faced long odds before, but this felt different, like trying to outrun a star with a broken thruster. Becker tried to keep spirits up with well-timed jokes and raunchy anecdotes, but even her relentless optimism was wearing thin. "We're not exactly brimming with options here, are we?" Zane asked, leaning back and folding his arms over his chest. "Not unless Tessa has discovered a previously unknown method of pulling miracles out of her cortex," Jorn said, glancing at the astrogator who had joined them with her ubiquitous data pad. "Sorry, fresh out of those," Tessa replied dryly, tapping away at her pad. "Although I did manage to calculate that if we all held hands and wished really hard, we'd still get squished." "Good to know," Jorn said. "Always appreciate your thoroughness." In the background, the ship's systems hummed with a kind of mechanical anxiety, like they knew their guts were being rearranged by a madman with a wrench and a dream. Ivo kept working, sweat dripping onto the circuitry as he muttered a string of curses that would make a pirate blush. "Listen, we may not have much time," Ivo said, looking up at Jorn. "But if I reroute the auxiliary power and jerry-rig a feedback loop, we might just get enough juice for one shot. One very, very expensive shot. One shot." Jorn repeated, eyebrows raised. "What is this, a space opera, more like a space tragedy?" Zane interjected, earning a snort from Becker. "All right, we go with the one-shot plan," Jorn decided, rubbing his temples as if trying to massage some common sense into the situation. "Let's hope our aim's better than our luck." Ivo nodded, diving back into the mess of wires and circuits. "I'll need a couple of days to sort this out and pray I don't blow a fuse." "Or 10. Jorn left the engine room, giving Ivo the space and questionable peace he needed to work his magic, or whatever passed for it these days. He found Solstice in orbit around his thoughts, dipping in and out of his consciousness with all the subtlety of a hyperactive child on sugar high. "Captain," Solstice chimed in as Jorn entered the bridge, "I must commend your crew on their tenacity, though I question the wisdom of placing our fate in the hands of anyone who uses duct tape as a primary repair method." "It's not like NASA's giving out spare parts, Solstice," Jorn replied, settling into his chair. "Besides, duct tape is the universal constant of repairs." "I shall note that for future reference," Solstice replied cheerfully. "Would you like me to prepare any last messages for posterity?" "Let's save that for when we're really out of options," Jorn said, glancing at the looming rogue planet on the screen. "We've still got some fight left in us." The bridge was a mix of tension and anticipation, the crew hovering near their stations like vultures over a soon-to-be sandy dinner. Tessa was deep in calculations, Becker was playing with one of her many homemade gadgets, and Zane was doing his best impression of a bored statue. "Time for a pep talk, Cap," Zane suggested, breaking the silence. "Sure," Jorn said, standing up and clearing his throat with the gravitas of a man who had faced and insulted death on multiple occasions. "All right, team, we're about to do something incredibly stupid and almost certainly dangerous. But if anyone can do it, it's us. We've got one shot, so let's make sure it counts." Becker let out a whoop, and even Tessa cracked a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to bolster their sagging spirits. As Ivo continued his work, the rest of the crew prepared for the final showdown with their cosmic foe. 2 days passed in a blur of frantic activity and nervous energy. The crew worked tirelessly to prepare for the firing sequence, each of them acutely aware of just how precarious their situation was. Ivo's technical wizardry or lack thereof would make or break them. "All right," Ivo said, stepping back from the tangled mess of the solar farm with a deep breath. "We're ready to go." "I think you think?" Jorn asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well, it's more of an educated guess, really," Ivo admitted, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that looked like it had seen too many wipeouts. "But I'm about 60% sure it won't explode immediately." "Guess we'll take those odds," Becker said, adjusting the controls. "What's life without a little risk longer?" Zane replied dryly. With everyone in position, they prepared to fire the makeshift superlaser. The rogue planet loomed ever closer, its icy surface a promise of carnage they intended to break. "Powering up," Ivo announced, flipping switches and pressing buttons with the urgency of a man who knew he was playing chicken with a celestial body. The ship vibrated with the buildup of energy, lights flickering as power surged through the rigged system. The crew held their collective breath, watching the progress indicators creeping toward maximum output. "Steady," Jorn commanded, eyes locked on the display. "Steady," Becca repeated, her voice tight with anticipation. As the count reached 0, Ivo slammed his palm down on the final button, and the ship groaned with the release of energy. A beam of light shot out from the solar farm, streaking toward the rogue planet like a cosmic spear. For a moment, everything held breathless stillness, as if the universe had paused to witness their audacity. Then the beam struck the planet, and the display lit up with readings indicating a shift in trajectory. "It's working," Tessa reported, her voice tinged with disbelief and relief. The crew cheered, their collective shout echoing through the ship. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd altered the path of the rogue planet and bought themselves precious time. "Well, I'll be damned," Jorn said, his usual cynicism giving way to a rare smile. "We actually did it." "Of course we did," Becca replied, her voice filled with triumph. "We're too stubborn to go down without a fight." As the immediate threat faded, the crew settled back into their routine, the weight of impending doom lifted for the moment. They might have been a ragtag band of misfits in a creaky old ship, but they'd proven they could face even the most daunting challenges with wit, bravery, and just a smidge of recklessness. As Jorn watched his crew, he felt a surge of pride and gratitude. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, and they'd face it with the same irreverent, stubborn determination that had seen them through this latest crisis. "All right, team," Jorn said, settling back into his chair. "Let's see what else the universe has in store for us, and try not to break anything else in the process." With that, the Solstice continued its journey through the cosmos, its crew ready for whatever the dark, grinning void decided to throw their way next. The Solstice was an old ship, one of those clunky models that looked like it had been assembled by a particularly stingy committee. With its narrow corridors and rusting panels, it creaked through space like a cosmic grandfather clock running on borrowed time. Captain Jorn Arstel, with his early morning aversion and sarcasm that could cut glass, was its equally antiquated captain. Right now, he was faced with the delightful news that their rogue planetary friend had decided to pick up the pace, like a jogger suddenly remembering a dentist appointment. "Good news, folks," Jorn announced, holding a cup of what could generously be called coffee. "Our rogue planet is really eager to meet us. It sped up its timeline, so we've got even less time to smash it into something resembling a coherent plan." Zane, sitting on a precariously balanced crate, raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that just the universe's way of saying it's got a crush on us?" "More like a psychotic ex who found our new address," Becker chimed in, fiddling with some gadget that looked like it was originally meant for something entirely different. "So how screwed are we on a scale of oops to cataclysmic? We're teetering somewhere around 'do you want fries with that apocalypse?'" Jorn replied, taking a sip and grimacing. "God, I miss real coffee. This tastes like it was brewed through an old boot." Solstice's cheery voice piped up over the intercom. "If it helps any, Captain, the probability of our survival has increased by 0.2% since our last calculation." "Ah, statistics," Zane said, leaning back. "Always there to remind you that someone out there is having a worse day." "Doctor," Tessa Cord was tapping away at her data pad like it owed her money. "If we're going to survive this, we need more power. We can't keep relying on Ivo to work magic with spit and solder." Jorn turned to her, his eyebrows doing their best approximation of a skeptical caterpillar. "Got any bright ideas that don't involve turning us into a star-shaped pancake?" Tessa didn't look up. "The ship's core. If we can tap into it, we might be able to harness just enough power to give us a fighting chance." "Let me get this straight," Jorn said, setting his cup down with a thunk. You want to mess with the one thing keeping our atoms from scattering across the galaxy. You said it yourself, Captain, Tessa replied, glancing up with a smirk. We're teetering on the edge, why not push our luck a little further? Becker laughed, the sound echoing through the mess hall. I love it when you talk danger, Tessa. It's like you're flirting with death itself. Except death's not buying me dinner first, Tessa shot back. Ivo, looking like he just returned from a particularly brutal sparring session with a junction box, joined them. If we're doing this, I need to make sure the conduits won't blow a gasket or 10. Well, nothing like a little light engineering to keep things interesting, Zane said, getting up and stretching. I'll assist. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? Don't say that, Becker warned, frowning at him. You'll jinx it. I think we're a bit beyond jinxing, Beck, Jorn said, scratching his chin. But hey, if we're going out, might as well go out with a bang, right? The crew nodded, a grim determination settling over them like a shared shrug at an unwelcome chore. As they made their way to the engine room, Solstice chimed in again. Captain, I feel it necessary to remind you that the ship's core is highly unstable if tampered with incorrectly. You're a regular ray of sunshine, Solstice, Jorn muttered. Let's just hope Ivo's got the magic touch. The engine room was its usual mess of whirring machinery and flashing lights. Ivo and Zane set to work, tools clanking and sparks flying as they plunged into the heart of the ship's systems. How's it looking, Ivo? Jorn asked, leaning against a wall that looked like it might have been scolded by a plasma torch at some point. Like a nightmare, Ivo replied without looking up. But nightmares are what keep life interesting, right? Sure, Zane added, handing Ivo a tool that looked like it belonged in a medieval torture chamber. Keeps you on your toes at least. Doctor. Cord was outside the room, monitoring the readings on her data pad. Remember, gentlemen, we're aiming for spectacular and improbable success, not catastrophic and fiery demise. So, no pressure then, Zane said, grinning as he twisted a bolt into place. Ivo wiped his forehead with his sleeve. All right, I think we're ready to try this. Just, hold on to something. Jorn and the rest of the crew braced themselves as Ivo initiated the sequence. The ship thrummed with energy, the lights dimming and flickering ominously like a horror movie was about to start. Core access initiated, Solstice reported, sounding much too cheerful for what was going on. Please be advised, potential catastrophic failure is imminent. Just what I wanted to hear, Jorn said, gripping the nearest railing. Ready when you are, Ivo. Ivo took a deep breath, steeling himself. All right, let's see if we can push those odds in our favor. He pressed a series of buttons and flicked a switch, the sound of machinery churning and clunking filling the room. The ship shuddered, and for a moment it seemed like everything might just hold together. We're getting increased power output, Tessa called from her station. Keep it steady. It's beautiful, Zane said, watching the readouts. Like watching a swan dive off a cliff. Let's just hope it doesn't crash and burn, Becker added, eyes glued to her own display. Ivo adjusted a dial, sweat beading on his forehead. We're almost there, just a little more, the ship groaned, a deep, unsettling rumble that echoed through the corridors. The lights flickered again, and for a heart-stopping moment everything went dark. Solstice, Jorn called, voice tense. A second later, the systems rebooted, lights flickering back to life. Solstice's voice came through with a slight digital cough. Apologies, Captain. Temporary power fluctuation. Power levels are now stable. What's our status? Jorn demanded, hoping against hope that the gamble had paid off. Tessa was already scanning the data. We've got enough power to hold our trajectory. It's not perfect, but it'll buy us some time. Time we desperately need, Jorn said, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Good work, everyone. I can't believe that actually worked, Zane said, shaking his head with a disbelieving grin. I was pretty sure we were about to toast ourselves. Only half-baked, Becker quipped. We might be crazy, but we're not that reckless. The crew shared a collective sigh of relief, tension easing just enough to let a sliver of hope peek through. They'd managed to stave off disaster for the moment, barely. But they all knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Jorn gathered them once more in the mess hall, the grim reality of their situation settling over them like a well-worn cloak. He knew they needed more than just technical bravado to see them through the coming storm. "All right, listen up," he began, looking around at his crew, his family. "We might be standing on the edge of a cosmic pit and the universe isn't exactly sending us love letters. But here's the thing about humans. We don't quit. We don't lay down and let the cosmos steamroll us into stardust. We fight back." Becker nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "Damn right we do. We may be short on resources, running on fumes and held together with duct tape and hope, but we're still here," Jorn continued, feeling a surge of defiant pride. "So let's keep doing what we've always done, proving the universe wrong." Zane gave a mock salute, a grin on his face. "Captain, you're either crazy or a genius, or both." "Probably both," Tessa agreed with a wry smile. The crew laughed, the sound hearty and genuine, their spirits bolstered despite the looming threat. They weren't out of the woods yet, but they'd face whatever came next with grit and irreverent humor that defied the darkness closing in. "Let's get back to work," Jorn said, clapping his hands. "We've got a rogue planet to outwit, and I'd like to do it with as little combusting as possible." With renewed determination, the Solstice and her crew continued their dance through the void, ready to meet the next challenge head-on. Whatever the universe had in store, they'd tackle it together, with sarcasm, duct tape, and the unyielding spirit of humanity. The days had started blending together into one long, caffeine-deprived horror show aboard the Solstice. Captain Jorn Arstel staggered into the mess hall, the ship's equivalent of a cozy corner coffee shop if that coffee shop happened to be on the verge of a health and safety violation. Becker was already fiddling with some unholy contraption that sparked ominously every few seconds. Zane lounged nearby, feet propped up like he was on vacation, not staring down a rogue planet that was determined to make them one with the cosmos. "Morning, sunshine," Zane greeted, raising a mug of sludge that might have once fancied itself coffee. "Don't remind me," Jorn groaned, scratching at the stubble that had sprouted from too many restless nights. "Why does this ship never run out of the bad stuff?" "Solstice must have a taste for irony," Becker offered, not looking up from his gadget. "Coffee so bad it makes you appreciate the end of days." "Doctor," Tessa Cord, tapping away at her data pad with the fury of a woman wronged by technology itself, chimed in. "Well, unless Ivo pulls a miracle out of his toolkit, end of days might be sooner than we'd like." Jorn sighed, sinking into a chair that groaned under his weight. "How's our superlaser looking, Tessa? Have we managed to turn it into anything more than an expensive light show?" "Well," Tessa started, her tone dripping with sarcasm, "if by light show you mean fizzling disappointment, then we're right on track." "Perfect," Jorn said deadpan. "Just perfect. You know, I really thought the universe would at least buy us dinner before screwing us over," Zane remarked, swirling the contents of his cup with a grimace. "Joke's on us, I guess," Becker replied. "We're the buffet." The sense of humor was dark, but it was the only thing keeping them from spiraling into despair as they prepared to test the superlaser, a desperate, last-ditch effort to divert the rogue planet. The mood in the engine room was about as cheerful as a funeral, which, given their circumstances, was almost fitting. Ivo Drake, the ship's engineer and resident miracle worker, was elbow-deep in cables, looking like he was wrestling a particularly stubborn octopus. "All right, folks, moment of truth. Let's see if we can make this bucket of bolts do something impressive for once." Zane peered over Ivo's shoulder, eyebrows raised. "Should we be worried that you're saying this in the same tone a gambler uses before rolling his last die? Just keeping things interesting," Ivo said, connecting the last wire with a flourish. "Ready when you are, Captain," Jorn nodded, a feeling of unease settling in like an unwanted houseguest. "All right, Solstice, give us a little magic." "Initiating superlaser test," Solstice announced in her annoyingly chipper voice. "Please stand by for potential catastrophic failure." "Always with the pep talks, Solstice," Jorn muttered, bracing himself as the ship began to hum with energy. At first, Everything seemed to be going surprisingly smoothly. The power conduits whined, lights flickering in a way that suggested the universe might not hate them entirely. But just as hope dared to peek in, the hum turned into an alarming clatter, the kind that suggested a tantrum was about to be thrown by the universe's angriest toddler. The lights flickered once more, and the ship shuddered like it had taken a punch to the gut. Sparks erupted from the panels, painting the room in a chaotic light show that was more horror than Vegas. "Power overload," Becker shouted over the din, eyes wide as alarms blared. "Solstice, shut it down," Jorn ordered, gripping the nearest railing for dear life. Attempting to stabilize, Solstice responded, her voice tinged with static. "Warning, system failure imminent." The lights flared blindingly bright, then went dark. For a few harrowing moments, the only sound was the crew's collective breath, held as if it might keep the ship from unraveling completely. Then, with a reluctant groan, the emergency lights flickered back to life, casting everything in a sickly, orange glow. The superlaser was silent, the threat of imminent explosion replaced by an oppressive, disheartening quiet. "Well," Zane said, breaking the silence with a nonchalance that belied the desperation in his eyes. "That could have gone better. Could have gone worse too," Becker added, though the humor in his voice was brittle, stretched thin by the reality of their predicament. Jorn ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of leadership like a particularly ill-fitting hat. "All right, folks, let's face facts. We're out of tricks, and Ivo's toolbox might as well be filled with wishes and broken dreams." The rest of the crew gathered around, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and defiance. They had come so far, endured so much, yet here they were, staring down a fate that seemed designed to crush them just for kicks. "Do we have any other options?" Tessa asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Not unless Ivo here can whip up a miracle from duct tape and prayers," Jorn replied, his voice barely a whisper above the hum of the emergency systems. Ivo, though battered by the setbacks and failures, had a glint in his eye that suggested he wasn't quite ready to surrender to despair. "Actually, Captain, there might be something." Jorn blinked, surprised enough to forget his usual sarcasm. "What are you talking about, Ivo?" "The solar panels," Ivo said, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's a long shot, but we haven't tapped their full potential. They're not just for collecting space dust, you know." "Of course," Tessa exclaimed, her eyes lighting up with sudden inspiration. "The panels were designed to absorb and convert massive amounts of energy. If we can reroute that power into the ship systems, we might just be able to give ourselves a fighting chance." "Are you saying we could convert the entire solar farm into a giant battery?" Zane asked, skepticism and hope warring in his voice. "Pretty much," Ivo confirmed, a small, defiant smile on his face. "We'd need to jury-rig the conduits and bypass about a dozen safety protocols, but it's possible. Safety protocols are for people who aren't hurtling towards a rogue planet," Becker said with a shrug. "Let's do it." Jorn pondered their options, or lack thereof, for a moment. It was a gamble of epic proportions, and not the kind he'd ever put money on. But when the universe dealt you a bad hand, sometimes you had to bluff. "All right, I'm in," Jorn declared, the fire of determination flickering back to life. "Let's turn this ship into the universe's biggest battery and show that planet what we're made of." The crew erupted into motion, the air crackling with renewed purpose. Desperation might have been breathing down their necks, but they were human, damn it. And if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was flipping the bird to impossible odds. "Solstice," Jorn said, slipping back into his role with a confidence that belied the chaos around him. "Prepare to reroute all auxiliary power to the solar farm. Let's see if we can turn this hunk of junk into something that might actually save our skins." "Understood, Captain," Solstice replied, her voice back to its usual perky self. Rerouting power now. The crew worked tirelessly, driven by the adrenaline of a last-chance effort. Ivo and Becker dove into the guts of the ship's machinery, their hands moving with the precision of seasoned gamblers hedging their bets. Zane and Tessa assisted wherever they could, navigating the tangled web of wires and relays like a pair of engineers on caffeine and desperation. Jorn monitored their progress, his gaze flicking between the chaotic dance of his crew and the data streaming across the screens. He didn't know if it would work, didn't know if any of them would survive this gamble, but he did know one thing: they wouldn't go quietly. Hours passed, the ship's systems groaning under the strain, but the crew didn't falter. Not once did they waver, not once did they question their course, even as the reality of their situation pressed down like the weight of a collapsing star. Finally, with a final twist of a wrench and a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, Ivo stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's done," he announced, his voice hoarse but triumphant. "We're ready to try it." "Great," Jorn said, feeling a strange calm settle over him. "Solstice, initiate the power transfer. Let's see what this ship can really do." The ship shuddered, the lights dimming as power surged into the solar farm. It was a leap of faith, a desperate gamble that could either spell their salvation or their doom. But even as the universe loomed large and remorseless, the crew of the Solstice stood defiant, ready to face whatever came next with a grin and a snarky comment. After all, they were human, and if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was making the impossible possible, one reckless, beautiful moment at a time. The crew of the Solstice had all the enthusiasm of a funeral procession as they set about transforming their solar farm into a makeshift battery. It was like trying to turn a rusty toaster into a jet engine, only with more sparks and the looming threat of fiery death. Ivo Drake, the engineer who could make miracles from scrap metal and sheer stubbornness, was at the helm of this little venture. He was eyeballs deep in a labyrinth of wires, hands moving with the delicate precision of someone defusing a bomb. He just hoped that, when this particular bomb went off, it'd be at the rogue planet and not them. "Zane, I need that flux capacitor," Ivo called out, knowing full well that it wasn't the actual name, but it sounded cooler, and who was going to argue at this point. "Here you go, Doc Brown," Zane replied, tossing a chunk of machinery that might have been intended for some other purpose entirely. "Hope you know what you're doing." "Confidence is high," Ivo said, which in Ivo speak meant they were utterly screwed but going down swinging. Meanwhile, Captain Jorn Arstel was doing his best to motivate the troops, which mostly involved thinly veiled sarcasm and the occasional pep talk that left everyone more confused than inspired. "All right, folks, let's remember. We're not out of this yet," Jorn said, clapping his hands together in what he hoped looked like leadership. "We've faced worse odds, right? Sure, if you count that time with the rampaging space wombats," Becker chimed in, not looking up from the sparking gadget he was tweaking. "And even then, I think we had better insurance." Dr. Tessa Cord, nose buried in her data pad, muttered something colorful about the reliability of both technology and the men who designed it. Her calculations were a mess of numbers and variables that seemed to change by the minute. It was like trying to balance a checkbook while the bank manager laughed maniacally in the background. "These numbers are like a blindfolded drunk," she said, exasperated. "They can't decide where they want to go." "Sounds like my last relationship," Zane quipped, earning a few chuckles from the others. Ivo stood up, dusting himself off and surveying the chaos. "Okay, we're ready for another test. This time, let's hope the universe has pulled the stick out of its cosmic ass." Jorn nodded, though his expression was more grim than hopeful. "Solstice, prepare to power up the solar farm. Let's see if we can make this work without frying us in the process." "Initiating power transfer," Solstice replied, her voice as cheerfully oblivious as ever. "Please brace for potential meltdown." With a collective breath held, they watched as the ship groaned into life. Panels hummed, wires crackled, and for a moment it seemed like they might actually have a shot. "Come on, you magnificent beast," Ivo whispered to the ship, willing it to not implode spectacularly. The lights flickered in a way that suggested the universe might have taken pity on them after all. The hum of energy was steadier this time, less like a toddler throwing a tantrum and more like a teenager reluctantly doing chores. "Keep your eyes on the prize, folks," Jorn said, his voice slicing through the tension. "We're not out of this yet. Captain's right," Becker added, though his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted a panel. "Still got a planet to dodge and a universe to shame." Tessa punched a few more numbers into her pad, eyes darting over the figures like a gambler watching the roulette wheel spin. "Numbers are stabilizing. We might just pull this off. Not to jinx it," Zane said, "but if this actually works, drinks are on me." "Assuming there's anything left of us to drink," Ivo muttered, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes, the kind that suggested maybe, just maybe, they weren't entirely doomed. As the power continued to flow, the ship seemed to steady itself, like a boxer shaking off the cobwebs before returning to the fight. The solar panels hummed with potential energy, each one a piece of a jigsaw puzzle that might just complete the picture. "Superlaser charging at 20%, Solstice reported, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "No immediate signs of catastrophic failure." "That's the best news I've heard since my last divorce," Zane remarked, and the crew chuckled, the sound tinged with nerves but genuine. As the power level crept higher, the atmosphere in the engine room shifted from bleak desperation to hesitant optimism. Sure, they were still a tiny speck of humanity facing down an indifferent universe, but for the first time in weeks, they felt like they might have a fighting chance. 50%, Solstice announced. "System stability holding." Jorn let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Good job, people. Let's keep it together." "No promises," Becker said, but there was a grin tugging at his lips despite the shadows under his eyes. Ivo was back in the thick of it, tweaking systems and crossing wires, his mind a whirl of calculations and approximations that only he seemed to understand. "If we can keep this up, we might just have a working superlaser. Or a really impressive light show," Tessa added, though there was a spark of hope in her eyes too. The tension in the room was a living thing, twisting and coiling with every percentage point that ticked by. It was a gamble, a leap into the unknown with nothing but their wits and a prayer to guide them. But they were human, damn it, and if there was one thing they knew how to do, it was spit in the eye of fate and make their own damn luck. 70%, Solstice chimed in. "Power levels are within acceptable parameters." "Acceptable. I'll take acceptable," Jorn said, relief creeping into his voice. "Let's push it a bit more." "We're close." The crew worked in a synchronized frenzy, hands moving with a rhythm that spoke to their unity and desperation. They were a ragtag bunch, battered by circumstance and running on fumes, but in that moment they were a team. "Just a bit longer," Ivo muttered, fingers flying over the controls like a virtuoso playing a particularly complicated symphony of chaos. "Almost there," Tessa encouraged, her eyes glued to her data pad, numbers dancing in her vision. The room was a cacophony of sound, whirring machinery, the occasional curse as something sparked, the steady heartbeat of hope against the backdrop of despair. 80%, Solstice reported, her voice a constant amid the chaos. "Keep it steady," Jorn urged. "This is it, people. Let's make it count." The ship trembled, shivering under the strain but holding, defying the odds with every second that passed. The crew held their breath, eyes wide, hearts thundering in their chests. "Come on, you beautiful bastard," Zane whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ship. And then, as if by miracle or sheer force of will, the superlaser powered up, the energy coursing through the ship like a living thing, vibrant and unstoppable. 100%, Solstice announced, her voice triumphant. "Superlaser is fully operational." A cheer erupted from the crew, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed through the engine room like music. It was a victory, a hard-fought and well-deserved win that tasted sweeter than any they could have imagined. "We did it," Jorn said, his voice cracking with emotion. "We actually did it." "Never doubted it for a second," Ivo said, though the relief in his eyes spoke volumes. "Looks like the universe might owe us a drink after all," Becker added, grinning despite the exhaustion etched into his features. Assuming we don't blow ourselves to bits when we fire this thing, Tessa cautioned, though her smile softened the warning. The crew basked in the moment, a rare triumph in a life defined by struggle and uncertainty. They had come together, defied the odds, and created something extraordinary from the chaos. "All right," Jorn said, rallying his crew with a nod. "Let's take a breather, then we'll figure out how to fire this damn thing and send that rogue planet packing." "Sounds like a plan," Zane replied, clapping Ivo on the shoulder. "You're a miracle worker, you know that." "Yeah, well, let's see if we can't make it 2 for 2, Ivo said, his voice full of determination. For the first time in what felt like forever, the crew of the Solstice allowed themselves to hope. The fight wasn't over, but they'd taken a huge step forward, and they were ready for whatever came next. After all, if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was pushing the limits, flipping the bird to fate, and rewriting their own destiny one defiant act at a time. The lights in the Solstice's engine room flickered like a cheap horror film effect, but Captain Jorn Arstel was too focused on not dying to appreciate the ambience. Everyone had their eyes glued to screens showing the rogue planet, a malevolent dot barely distinguishable in the sea of stars. It was a cosmic bowling ball, and they were the pin in the cosmic gutter of the universe's sense of humor. "All right, everyone," Jorn called out, trying to sound more Captain Y than panicky. "This is the moment we've all been waiting for. Time to kick some planetary ass." He grinned, though it felt more like a grimace and the crew couldn't tell if he was serious or joking. Ivo Drake, the ship's miracle-working engineer, was practically bouncing on his heels, fingers twitching with anticipation. "Hey, at least if we blow up, we won't have to worry about our next meal." "Yeah, and you'll never have to fix another flux capacitor," Zane chimed in, giving Ivo a playful nudge. "That thing's been the bane of your existence." "Speak for yourself," Becker added, his voice laden with sarcasm as he fiddled with his ever-sparking gadget. "I, for one, will miss the endless days of watching you tinker with that thing, Doctor." Tessa Cord rolled her eyes at the banter, her own data pad a cacophony of frantic calculations. "Can we focus, gentlemen? I'd rather not go out in a blaze of ineptitude." Solstice, their ever-cheerful AI, piped up with her trademark oblivious optimism. "Charging sequence initiated." "Please refrain from panicking, though I understand if you do." The crew shared a nervous laugh, and Jorn caught himself wondering if Solstice had been programmed with a sense of humor, or if it had developed on its own from living with them. "You heard the lady, folks. Let's keep our cool and hope the universe is in a forgiving mood." With each passing second, the tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. The Superlaser, affectionately dubbed the Big Boomstick by Zane, was their last hope of deflecting the rogue planet and saving their sorry hides. They'd worked tirelessly, jury-rigging the solar farm into this monstrosity, and now it was time to see if they'd stitched together a miracle or their own funeral pyre. "Superlaser at 90% charge," Solstice reported, her voice a beacon of calm amid the impending chaos. "Stability is within acceptable limits." "Acceptable limits," Becker echoed with a snort. "That's like saying this coffee is drinkable. It's technically true, but it doesn't mean you should drink it," Ivo finished, his hands flying over the controls with a reckless kind of precision. "All right, let's do this." "Everyone strapped in. As much as you can strap in when your ass is already grass," Zane said, giving his harness a reassuring tug. "Great. Let's keep our fingers crossed and our butts unclenched," Jorn said, trying to rally his crew with humor that barely masked his nerves. "If this works, hell, if we survive this, drinks are on me." "You're such a generous captain," Tessa quipped, her voice dry as the Martian desert. "That's what they tell me," Jorn replied, adjusting his grip on the rail. "All right, Ivo, on your mark." Ivo took a deep breath, eyes locked on the controls as if they held the secrets of the universe. "Superlaser at full charge. Ready to fire on your command, Captain." Jorn swallowed, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. "Let's do it." Fire the Big Boomstick. The air was electric with anticipation, and for a split second the universe seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a shudder that shook the solstice to its core, the superlaser fired, a brilliant beam of light lancing into the void, heading straight for the rogue planet. Time seemed to stretch, seconds dragging into eternity as they watched, breathless, praying that their makeshift death ray would be enough to alter the rogue planet's course. Come on, Zane muttered under his breath, eyes wide as saucers as he watched the screens. The beam connected, a brilliant flash of light erupting on the surface of the rogue planet. They held their collective breath, waiting for any sign that their desperate gamble had paid off. Impact confirmed, Solstice reported, her voice a soothing balm. Analyzing trajectory. Please tell me we did something, Becker said, his voice tinged with a desperate hope. The seconds ticked by, each one a lifetime of uncertainty. The rogue planet's trajectory data scrolled across their screens, numbers and graphs shifting in real time, and Tessa's eyes darted over the figures with the intensity of a poker player studying their hand. Come on, you cosmic bastard, move, Ivo whispered, his hands clenching the console like he could will the planet to change direction through sheer force of will. Trajectory adjusted, Solstice finally announced, and the tension in the room broke like a snapped cable. Rogue Planet's new path will miss the solar system by a safe margin. A cheer erupted from the crew, wild and exuberant, echoing off the metal walls of the engine room like a victory march. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd done it. Guess the universe picked the wrong crew to mess with, Zane said, grinning from ear to ear, eyes alight with triumph. Jorn felt an odd sense of weightlessness, like he was floating, buoyed by a tide of relief and disbelief. We did it, he said, his voice almost a whisper. We actually did it. Don't sound so surprised, Ivo said with a laugh, though the relief in his eyes was palpable. We're just that damn good. Becker let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his smile wide and unrestrained. I'm never doubting your crazy ideas again, Ivo. Yeah, well, don't make a habit of it, Ivo replied, though his tone was light. Next time we might not be so lucky, Doctor. Tessa Cord closed her eyes, a slow smile spreading across her face. I can't believe it. We actually did it. The numbers didn't betray us. First time for everything, Jorn said, leaning against the wall with a sigh. All right, I think we've earned a bit of a celebration. To surviving the universe's worst punchline, Zane said, raising an imaginary glass. The crew joined in with their own toasts, the sound of their laughter and relief filling the engine room. They'd faced impossible odds and come out the other side, bruised but unbroken. The rogue planet was no longer an immediate threat, and they'd bought themselves precious time to figure out what came next. All right, crew, Jorn said, his voice cutting through the chatter. Let's get this ship back to something resembling normal. We've got plenty of work ahead of us, but for now, let's just enjoy the fact that we're still alive. Aye, Captain, Becker replied, his grin wide and infectious. As the crew dispersed, returning to their stations with lighter hearts and renewed purpose, Jorn lingered, looking out at the stars through the viewport. They twinkled back at him, indifferent but somehow less menacing now that they'd faced one of their own and come out on top. Solstice, keep monitoring the rogue planet's trajectory, Jorn said, his voice low. Let's make sure it keeps moving in the right direction. Affirmative, Captain, Solstice replied, her voice a comforting presence in the quiet. Jorn nodded, letting himself breathe, really breathe, for the first time in what felt like weeks. They'd done it. They'd pulled off the impossible, and now they had a chance, however slim, to figure out their next steps. The universe, for all its chaos and cruelty, had thrown them a bone. And Jorn intended to make the most of it. With a final glance at the stars, he turned away, ready to join his crew to celebrate the victory they'd earned and the life they still had to live. Here's to us, he murmured, a small smile tugging at his lips. The luckiest unlucky bastards in the galaxy. The post-apocalyptic glow of the rogue planet's near-miss still hung in the air like a stubborn hangover, as if reminding the crew of the solstice that they were just one cosmic exhale away from obliteration. The mess hall, a small cozy corner of organized chaos, was now buzzing with a sense of disbelief. The crew sat around a beat-up table, mugs of terrible coffee in hand, their faces a mixture of relief and the what-the-hell-just-happened look you'd expect from people who just dodged interstellar extinction. "Well, that was a thing," Zane said, breaking the silence with his usual lack of subtlety. "Didn't think we'd get to have another one of these delightful coffee chats." Becker snorted into his cup, which miraculously hadn't shattered during the superlacer's roar. "I know, right? And here I was thinking my life's great achievement would be dying of caffeine poisoning." Doctor Tessa Cord was already nose-deep in her data pad, though for once the numbers weren't choking the life out of her. "I believe the technical term is statistical anomaly, but hey, even my worst calculations didn't see this one coming." "Ivo, you mad genius," Jorn said, raising his mug in mock salute. "I was about 90% sure we were about to become space debris." Ivo shrugged, the ghost of a grin playing on his lips. "What can I say? I like to keep expectations low, so when I do pull a miracle out of my hat, it's all the more impressive. Or we just get really lucky," Zane said. "But I'll take luck any day over being a cosmic pancake." Solstice chimed in, her voice still carrying that unyielding optimism that could have melted the cruelest of souls. "Congratulations, crew. I've logged this as a successful mission, though human probability models suggest that we should analyze methods to increase future success rates." Becker rolled his eyes. Yeah, we get it, Solstice. We're a bunch of reckless morons who got lucky." "We prefer the term daring pioneers," Jorn corrected, his tone teasing. "Remember, history is written by the survivors. Or at least by the ones who can still pay off their debts afterward," Tessa added dryly. The mention of debts brought a collective groan from the table, a reminder that even in space, the bureaucracy of human life was relentless. Debts, repairs, and the next mission all looming just beyond the horizon. "Before we get too caught up in patting ourselves on the back, we should probably figure out what we're doing next," Jorn said, the weight of leadership settling back onto his shoulders like an uncomfortable coat. "We've got a ship held together by duct tape and dreams, and a universe that's surely waiting to throw the next catastrophe our way." Ivo nodded, a thoughtful expression replacing his earlier excitement. "Yeah, the big boomstick did its job, but it's not something we can rely on for an encore performance. We need to get serious about repairs and upgrades. Maybe even find a way to make the coffee drinkable," Becker added, though his eyes carried a hint of hope. "Now that is a miracle beyond even my capabilities," Ivo replied, smirking. "Look, all joking aside," Jorn said, bringing the room's focus back to the immediate future. "We've proven today that we can handle whatever the universe throws at us. We just need to keep doing what we're best at, sticking together, improvising and complaining loudly enough that the universe gets tired of messing with us." Zane snickered. "Complaining? That I can handle." The mess hall filled with a chorus of laughter, a sound that was both defiant and comforting. The universe may have had its fun, but they were still here, still able to laugh in the face of chaos. In a way, that was their greatest victory. "So here's to more improbable victories," Jorn said, lifting his mug again. "And to surviving despite the odds." "To surviving," the crew echoed, clinking their mugs together in a toast that might have been half serious, half sarcastic, but all heart. As the chatter subsided, the weight of what they'd accomplished began to settle into a more tangible form, like the realization that maybe, just maybe, they were good at this after all. At the very least, they were still alive to complain about it. Solstice, ever the sentimental one, chimed in one last time. "Captain, crew, you've demonstrated remarkable resilience today. If I could feel pride, I'm certain this would be the moment for it." Becker raised an eyebrow. "Is that your way of saying you're impressed, Solstice?" "It's my way of saying I'm glad to still have all of you on board," the AI replied, her tone managing to sound both robotic and heartfelt. Jorn looked around at his crew, saw the mix of exhaustion and determination etched onto their faces, and felt the stirrings of something he hadn't expected: hope. "All right, Let's get back to work. We've got a ship to fix and a universe to explore. And I have a feeling we're just stubborn enough to do it. With a collective exhale, the crew rose from the table, the burdens of the day not erased but somehow more manageable now. They'd faced down one of the universe's cruelest jokes and walked away with a story to tell. And in a galaxy where the odds were never in their favor, that was no small feat. As they dispersed, heading back to their respective stations with renewed vigor, Jorn lingered a moment longer, watching the stars through the viewport. Each one was a reminder of the vastness of their playground, the sheer unpredictability of it all. "Here's to us," he murmured again, a private toast to the stars. The luckiest unlucky bastards in the galaxy. And with that he turned away, ready to face whatever came next with the stalwart crew of misfits who'd somehow become his family. The universe was vast, unpredictable, and often downright hostile, but they were still here, still fighting, and that was all that mattered. The solstice hummed around him, an indomitable presence that had carried them through hell and back. Together, they'd defied the odds, and as long as they stayed together, Jorn was confident they'd continue to do so. Because if there was one thing humanity was good at, it was surviving, even when the universe itself seemed hell-bent on proving otherwise. In the end, it wasn't just about surviving, though. It was about doing so with style, with humor, and with the kind of irreverent spirit that could face down even the darkest of days and laugh in its face. Jorn chuckled to himself as he walked, the sound echoing through the corridors of the solstice. They were indeed the luckiest unlucky bastards, and in a universe that rarely played fair, that was the best kind of victory.